few years ago, something really strange happened to me. It was summer, and my family and I had just come back from a week-long beach vacation. Everything was perfect while we were away. Sunny days, sandy beaches, and a lot of fun. But the first night back home, things started getting weird. Around 2 a.m., I was woken up by our doorbell ringing. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor needing help, so I got up and went downstairs to check. But when I looked through the peephole, no one was there. I opened the door and stepped outside, but the street was empty, completely silent. I figured whoever it was must have left before I got there, so I went back to bed, a little confused, but not too worried. The next night I was woken up again, but this time it wasn't the doorbell. It was knocking on our back door. It was around midnight, and this time I felt a chill. It was strange that someone would come to our back door in the middle of the night. I went to check, but once again no one was there. The same eerie silence greeted me. I went back to bed, but it was hard to fall asleep after that. The following day, I noticed my neighbor, Mr. Ross, installing a security camera on his porch. I went over to talk to him, thinking maybe he'd had a similar experience. When I told him about the doorbell and the knocking, he told me something that sent shivers down my spine. While we were away on vacation, there had been a terrible car accident right in front of our house. A woman had died in the crash. Mr. Ross was the first one on the scene, and he saw the woman get out of her car, injured and stumbling. But before he could reach her, she collapsed. The paramedics later said it was strange she even managed to get out of the car, given how severe her injuries were. After the accident, several neighbors, including Mr. Ross, started experiencing strange things. Doorbells ringing in the middle of the night, knocks on doors, but when they checked, no one was ever there. That's why Mr. Ross installed the camera, hoping to catch whoever was doing it. That night, the knocking came again, this time on my front door. I was too scared to get up, so I just lay in bed, listening to the sound, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The next morning, I went back to Mr. Ross, and we reviewed his camera footage. The camera had recorded his doorbell ringing around 3 a.m., but no one was there. We watched the entire night's footage, but not a single person appeared on the screen. Other neighbors put up cameras too, and they all reported the same thing. Doorbells ringing, knocks on doors, but no one ever seen. This continued for about 2 weeks, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. No one knows what caused it, and we never found any explanation. I live in a mountain area where the roads are tight, so everyone has to drive slowly to avoid accidents. My job is about 30 minutes from my house, and every night I take the same route home. One night, around 9 p.m., I was driving as usual. There was a car behind me, and occasionally other cars passed by in the opposite direction, all moving slowly due to the narrow roads. But that night, something strange happened. I blacked out for a moment. I can't remember what led to it, and I wasn't sleepy at all. Suddenly, I snapped back to consciousness and realized I had fallen asleep. My car was stopped in the middle of the road. When I looked up, I saw a car in the opposite lane also stopped, with the driver looking just as confused as I felt, as if he had just woken up too. I checked my rearview mirror and noticed that the car behind me was also stopped, with the driver looking equally confused. It was like we all fell asleep at the same time, and our cars somehow came to a stop without colliding. We exchanged glances, still trying to process what had just happened, and then we all slowly started driving again, as if nothing unusual had occurred. A little further down the road, the car behind me started flashing its headlights. I pulled over, and the driver pulled up next to me. He asked if what he thought happened had really happened. He noticed that I had fallen asleep, and the other driver seemed to be in the same dazed state as him. I told him I had no idea what had happened, and that I was just as confused as he was. We talked for a few minutes, both of us unable to explain the bizarre event. We wished each other well and went our separate ways. To this day, I can't explain what caused all of us to fall asleep so suddenly in the middle of the road. It's a mystery that still haunts me whenever I drive that route at night. I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment. The second bedroom is reserved for guests, like my parents and younger brother who visit often, so I rarely use it. Because of this, I always keep the door closed. However, there was one strange week when I kept finding the door slightly ajar. At first, I didn't think much of it, just closed the door and moved on. But as the week went on, I noticed that this was happening constantly. Every time I walked past the room, the door would be slightly open, even though I was sure I had closed it earlier. I checked the handle, thinking maybe it was faulty, but everything seemed to be in working order. Despite this, the door kept opening, even when I was in the apartment. I never heard it creak open, or any noises that might suggest something was off. It would just be open when I noticed it. Determined to figure out what was going on, I decided to test things. One morning before leaving for work, I made sure the window in the room was closed, so there was no chance of wind causing the door to move. I closed the door firmly and placed a chair against the handle, wedging it tightly so the door couldn't be easily opened. I even pushed against it to make sure the chair was holding it securely. Satisfied that the door wouldn't budge, I left for work. But when I returned at the end of the day, I found the door wide open, and the chair that I had used to secure it was lying on the floor. This time, the situation made me feel so uneasy that I couldn't stay in the apartment. I quickly packed a bag and went to a friend's house where I stayed for 2 days. After those 2 days, I felt a bit more at ease and returned to my apartment. When I got back, the door was open again, just like before. But this time, after I closed it, the door stayed shut. It never opened on its own again. It's been a while since this happened, and I still live in the same apartment. The door hasn't moved on its own since, but the memory of that strange week still lingers. I've never found an explanation for what happened, but I'm relieved that whatever it was, it seems to be over. I work in a hospital, mainly in the management sector, dealing with office tasks and equipment. One early morning, it was just me and a colleague working. Both of us were focused on our computers. Suddenly, we heard a knock coming from the door near us. It was the door to a small room where we kept office equipment and printers. No one ever worked inside that room, and if someone needed to use it, they usually left the door open. The knock was distinct and sounded like a proper human knock, not like something had fallen. My colleague immediately looked up, her eyes wide, staring at me and then at the door. I even asked her if she had heard it too, and she confirmed she did. Feeling uneasy but curious, I decided to check it out. I approached the door, opened it, and found the room completely empty. It was silent as usual, with no sign of anyone having been there. The whole situation was so strange that we laughed it off and went back to work. About 30 minutes later, we both heard the printer in that same room start up, as if someone was printing something. My colleague looked at me again, her eyes wide with disbelief. I went to check on the printer, and to my surprise, it was spitting out blank sheets of paper. It wasn't printing anything. The papers were just coming out blank. I unplugged the printer, plugged it back in, and spent the rest of the day on edge, waiting to see if anything else would happen. But nothing did. The printer worked normally after that, and we never experienced anything creepy like that again. I used to work in a small office where everyone knew each other pretty well, or at least I thought we did. There was one guy, Tom, who always seemed a bit off. He was quiet, kept to himself, and had this distant look in his eyes, like he was always deep in thought about something no one else could understand. But I never thought much of it. One afternoon, we had a meeting scheduled in one of the smaller conference rooms. It was just going to be me and Tom, going over some project details. We both walked in, and I heard the click of the lock. That was strange. I turned to ask him why he locked the door, but before I could say anything, I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. There was a wildness there, a kind of frenzied energy that I hadn't seen before. His usual quiet demeanor was replaced by an intense focus on me, like I was the only thing in the room that mattered. I asked what was going on. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he started pacing the room, mumbling to himself. I could barely make out what he was saying, but it was something about them and how they were watching him, how he couldn't trust anyone anymore. His voice was growing louder, more frantic, and I realized with a sinking feeling that something was very, very wrong. I suggested we talk outside, trying to stay calm and not provoke him. but he wasn't listening. He was caught up in whatever was happening in his mind, and it was like I wasn't even there anymore. Then, out of nowhere, he stopped pacing and turned to face me. His eyes were wide, his breathing heavy. He said that they told him I was one of them and that I had been stalking him. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I asked him who they were and assured him I wasn't stalking him, trying to break through whatever delusion he was trapped in. But he wasn't hearing me. His grip tightened on the back of one of the chairs, knuckles white, and I realized I needed to get out of that room fast. I slowly moved toward the door, trying not to alarm him. But he noticed, and in an instant, he was between me and the door, blocking my way. He told me he wouldn't let me leave. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know how long I could keep him talking, how long before he did something unpredictable, something violent. I tried to reason with him, to convince him that we could figure this out together, but every word seemed to push him further into whatever nightmare he was living in. Just when I thought there was no way out, there was a loud knock on the door. Tom flinched, his attention momentarily distracted. It was enough. I took the chance, pushing past him with all my strength, fumbling with the lock and throwing the door open. I nearly ran into one of our co-workers who had come looking for us, concerned about how long the meeting was taking. I didn't say anything, just hurried out of the room, my heart still racing. Tom didn't follow. He just stood there staring at the floor, lost in his own world. The next day, Tom was taken to a hospital for treatment, though no one ever told us exactly what was wrong. That was one of the creepiest situations I've ever experienced.